Hello, I'm Camilla Zhang, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the 2020 Brooklyn Book Festival. This panel is called Worlds Within Worlds, When Fantasy Gets Real. And our speakers today are Carrie Peach, Vishak Som, Julia Groferrer, and Isabel Greenberg. Before we begin, I want to let you know that books by authors in this program can be purchased in the link below. For those who don't know me, I'm Camilla Zhang, formerly Kickstarter's Comics Outreach Lead. As a creator myself, I've been published by Top Cow and Kickstarted projects like Reading with Pictures and Cross Genres. I've also worked with Marvel, Mad Cave, and DC Comics, where I served as assistant editor on the entire Before Watchmen series, Batman Black and White Volume 4, Batman Death by Design, and Batman Noel. And now I'm a crowdfunding consultant and freelance writer of comics and prose. Carrie Peach is a cartoonist based out of Brooklyn, New York. Her work includes drawing for Lumberjanes and the Mages of Mystralia webcomic. Peach also makes keepsakes and other original comics about magic and empathy. Along with brightening her workdays, the Adventure Zone got her to join Dungeons & Dragons campaigns. She is an author of the recent graphic novel, The Adventure Zone, Petals to the Metal. Vishak Som, author of Spellbound, a graphic memoir, grew up in New York City with parents who are originally from India. She received a master's degree in architecture from Harvard University and worked for many years in that field, most notably at I.M. Pei's New York office. Vishak's work has appeared in The New Yorker, The Boston Review, BuzzFeed, and The Huffington Post. She is also the author of a collection of stories titled Aspara Engine. Vishak lives in Brooklyn, New York. Julia Groferrer, creator of Vision, is a writer and artist from New Hampshire. Her comics have appeared in Cicada Magazine, Kramer's Ergo, and 3 volumes of Best American Comics. She self-publishes mini comics under the imprint Thuban Press, and her 2 other graphic novels, Laid Waste and Black is the Color, are also available from Fantagraphics Books. She lives in New York with writer Sean T. Collins and their beautiful children. Isabel Greenberg is a London-based illustrator and writer and author of the New York Times best-selling graphic novels, The Encyclopedia of Early Earth and The 100 Nights of Hero. Her most recent graphic novel is Glasstown, The Imaginary World of the Brontes, published by Abrams Comic Arts. So I just want to make sure that viewers can take a screenshot of this screen right here so that they can feel free to follow the panelists. So I'll just pause for a moment and let you guys take a screenshot, and we can begin with the questions. All right, so I'm going to start with Carrie. Carrie, what was it like adapting a purely audio world into a graphic one? How did you choose which parts to keep and which to change? And was there anything about the McElroy's voices that inspired your character designs and overall world building aesthetics?
Oh, that's a bunch of fun questions. So it's a collaborative process. So Clinton, Griffin, and Justin and Travis and I all have a lot of conversations throughout the process about exactly what you said, what gets translated into graphic novel form and what kind of has to be condensed or left out. I think one of the biggest goals in that adaptation process is to preserve the original tone of the podcast, even in a new medium, which I've no experience in other kinds of translation, but in adaptation, I feel like that's kind of a really interesting challenge, right? As you're using a completely different tool set to try to elicit the same tone and emotions in a reader as the original, as the work in the original medium did. So this is something we kind of talk about a lot, but when things are cut and condensed, it's in service of making room to instead emphasize other elements that will work really well on the page. And also with the benefit of hindsight, I think all the McElroys have been able to sit and stew with this story for so long because it is based on a completed arc of their podcast, that they now have these really, really wonderful insights about which parts of character arcs and which parts of the overall story they'd like to bring forward kind of earlier on, so that when those eventually pay off, it can read even better on the page. So that's kind of the highest level adaptation goal. In terms of, let me try to retain all the other pieces of the question.
Oh, I can totally re-ask them.
I think I got, so one of the other pieces was like audio to graphic, right? So I think one of the things I miss the most is absolutely the music of the podcast, because that was such a big piece of it. It's not just all of the information that you get from voice acting, but also like this original soundtrack that Griffin created to specifically enhance like what was happening on this show. So in comics, we obviously don't have that exact audio tool set, but we do have this other toolkit of things like how do you change the paneling on a page? How do you change the pacing by controlling which panels are larger, which are smaller, how you're changing page layouts, and then elements like color and like the way things are laid out on the screen. And by screen in this case, I mean comic, but I am looking at a computer screen and my brain is a bag of eels. Can really try to create the same emotion again in a reader that the music helped the viewer or the listener to feel in the first place. And lastly, you were asking about voices. I think the character design is also really collaborative. We do a bunch of rounds of like talking through what their intent was and what they had in mind for the graphic novel adaptation, and then just revise and revise and revise until it feels good to everybody. I think the really interesting element is going back and listening to the podcast has been a huge help in terms of providing this extra layer of information about like the way that characters are acting. So not just literally what was said, but like what's the tone of voice in this scene, and what's the background chatter that's happening, and that I love pulling from that to kind of flesh out what's going on in a scene on the page, right? Because that's a way to kind of get extra information about what background characters might be doing, and what's the gaze direction of characters who aren't directly involved in the action. How can you use that to guide the viewer's eye around the page? So I think it's that secondary layer of information that's been the most interesting to work to adapt.
Awesome, thank you. My next question is for Isabel. What was it about the Brontes' work that inspired you to create Glasstown? And what, as you mentioned in the note to the reader in the beginning, flights of fancy did you take from the Bronte Juvenilia to create the Glasstown you wanted to see, and why did you choose those things, or why did you want to expand upon those flights of fancy?
I'll answer the first half of the question first, obviously, because it's the first half of the question. So I was like a fan of the Brontes novels as a teenager. We read them at school in the UK, but I knew nothing about their juvenilia really for the whole time I was really absorbing their novels as a young adult. And when I kind of became aware of it, I think what made me want to work with it was I was just kind of in awe of the sort of like sheer scale of their world building. And I definitely approached it as a kind of, rather than seeing them, I think in that instance, as novelists whose work I was a fan of, I was like, wow, they're sort of fellow world builders. My two first graphic novels are set in an imaginary world. And I guess I knew from that how all-consuming it can be, and how so much doesn't go onto the page. And sort of the richer the world, the more is going on off page. And I grew up reading fantasy like by Ursula Le Guin and, you know, Pullman and Tolkien. And so I was just so impressed by their world building, and also how ahead of their times it seemed. I was just like blown away that these authors who were famous for writing kind of these bastions of, you know, traditional literature or whatever, were basically like role playing and creating these mad worlds when they were children. I think they probably would have like played Dungeons and Dragons if they'd have been alive today. I strongly think so. Or LARPing of some kind. Like they were full into immersive experiences. I was just fascinated by it, and I thought, I can't believe this hasn't been adapted. And it kind of seemed to me that a graphic novel was the perfect way to do it, because I could use so many different like visual layers to, I guess, cue the reader that we were changing between characters and time zones, and also, you know, they were also fantastically interested in art as well. Like they all sketched a lot. Branwell wanted to be a painter himself, so it made sense to me that it would be visual. Yeah, no, it was just such an interesting sort of thing to work with. In terms of your second question, like how I chose what to adapt, that kind of one of the hardest things I found in working with the text was that it wasn't really meant to be read in the way that their novels were. They kind of wrote it for each other. It was very much like this sort of collaborative thing that they did together. They worked on it over many years, so it's not, I guess, chronological. Plot lines evolved and they sort of scrapped them, revisited them years later. At one point, Emily and Anne sort of break away and form their own rival world. So there's just so much material, and it wasn't like a sort of straight adaptation of an existing story. So what I did is I sort of, the research process was really long, and then it sort of got to a point where I just had to shut all the books, stop looking at what they had done, and then kind of be like, this is my world now. I took sort of 5 or 6 of their characters, and the very bare bones of the plot arcs that they'd kind of followed during the course of the Juvenilia, and then just sort of ran with it. There was like a lot of stuff that felt natural to leave out because it just didn't sit right. It wouldn't have sat right with sort of 21st century readers. A lot of like quite offensive colonialism, just like for a starter, and just weird stuff that like I was like, this just is actually too mad. But then there was also a lot of stuff I was like, that's got to stay in. So yeah, that's kind of how I started to piece it together. But also I wanted to make sure that it ran alongside the story of how and why the Brontes created the world as well. So sort of linking their the biographical story with the story of the world that they were creating.
Yeah, thank you. That's all. Yeah, no, I mean, I kind of want to go a little deeper into like when you said that things started to deviate and you started to create your own world, like your own glass town. Like, I'm wondering, like, how did that come alive for you? You know, like at what point did you realize, oh, I've just got to need to run with the characters that like the Brontes created, but like I'm filling in the spaces, and when did they kind of become to separate? You know, that's actually also very similar to like one of the questions I want to ask Bashak later too.
I think it was like when I started actually working on the writing rather than the research, that was when it just very, very naturally sort of fell away. And particularly because I'm approaching it from a visual standpoint, which isn't something that they did. There aren't that many, there's maybe like a couple of illustrations they did of characters, but it was definitely like my world, and the visuals were, you know, I brought them, they came from my imagination. And so that I think was a really clear divider. But I did love some of their plot lines. So the characters that stayed are sort of Charlotte's main characters that she wrote with. So this guy called Charles Wellesley, who's this kind of Glasstown sort of, I guess in a way, gossip columnist. Like he wrote a lot, he would sort of comment on all the comings and goings of the characters. And then also like Zamorna, who's the most famous of her characters from the Juvenilia, and people kind of say he's like the pre-Mr. Rochester. So those are the characters that I like definitely kept. But I also wanted to make sure there was like a good balance of, like, I wanted there to be some really good female characters as well, because you know, for obvious reasons. So that was a case of like taking the characters that Charlotte had written and maybe, to be honest, leaving behind her versions of them, and definitely fleshing them out and making them sort of stronger and more interesting. Yeah.
Thank you. So my next question is for Bashak. At one point in Spellbound, you mentioned that Anjali starts out as your substitute, but then eventually becomes her own person. While you were creating the memoir, did you notice when you and her began to deviate, and how could you tell when she had become separate?
I actually don't know the exact point at which we started to diverge, but what I like to think is that that happened when I started to reckon with my own gender. Basically, when I came out as trans, I think the character of Anjali in my book stopped at that point. You know, there were the one-to-one correspondence between me and her started to dissolve a little bit, and she started to have her own adventures, and or maybe it was probably me having my own adventures or my own flights of fancy through her. But yeah, it was a question of the whole project, what the whole project meant. At some point it was a diary comic, which I was very reluctant to draw or to write because as a genre, it just never appealed to me. But I, embarked on this anyway, just as a way of marking time and, having a creative project. But soon, I guess I wasn't satisfied anymore with it being just a sort of recording of my daily comings and goings, and the meals I was making and stuff. And that at that point, I think that roughly coincided with me coming out as trans. And at that point, I think it started the book, which I didn't think I didn't think this would ever be a book, but I think the book project started to become something else. And it was, I think the whole project took on a sort of hybrid quality. And in addition to the diaristic stuff, it started going into more of my history or of Anjali's history. And then it also started to take on this flavor of like wish fulfillment and projection, I think, and that's when she started to become her own character. And yeah, I don't know how much of her is a reflection of me, but at some point she started to like, I started to recognize that there's a distance between us, and she would start to do things like, kind of rant at people on the subway, which is maybe something that I have wanted to do, or but I never got to because of social manners and stuff. But anyway, so yeah, I think it was there was a sort of happy meeting of me and my gender and Anjali sort of taking on her own life roughly at the same time while I was working on the book.
I definitely identify with Anjali's outbursts, like when she meets that hipster guy at a party and he's like, oh, you don't have a full-time job, how lucky for you, like,
right.
I just was like, and then she just explodes on him, and I'm just like, yeah,
that's exactly how I felt when I was working on, when I started devoting myself to comics and making art instead of doing what I had studied to do, which was architecture. And I kind of gave up doing all that, left behind the security to dive into art. And I was imagining sort of, what the self-critique would be of my privilege, being able to do that. So that little episode was a way of waylaying or, kind of heading off at the past, the critique that, that, and
justifying, like
your
reasons. Yeah.
I know, yeah. And I totally agree. It takes a level of privilege to be able to do some kinds of work, but that was a way for me to let loose a little bit and answer that critique.
Yeah, I mean, but also think about all the other artists in the past who have had that privilege and who have never, acknowledged it. And in any case, I think you deserve it, is what I'm trying to say. And I wanted to ask, the graphic novel that Anjali is working in the memoir, is it Aspara Engine?
It is, yeah. I mean, that. I mean, there are a few panels or shots where you see her drawing the comic, but that's not the content of Apsara Engine. But yes, I mean the whole, as far as the book is a diary comic, the graphic novel I was writing while that, oh God, now I've lost. It's become a hall of mirrors now. the book that I was writing while, oh God.
It's okay. It's a meta narrative.
It is upside
yes.
down too, yes. See what happens?
Yeah, it's cool though. It's like, that's why this panel is called Worlds Within Worlds, but thank you so much. I have definitely more questions, but I want to kind of get through all the written ones first. So my next question is for Julia. I don't know if I'm just maybe psychoanalyzing the vision book too much, but I feel like so many elements in the book reminded me of the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan's mirror stage, where self-identity occurs simultaneously with self-alienation, i.e. recognizing your reflected image as you and not you at the same time. From Eleanor's erotic rendezvous with her mirror to Robert's unconscious obsession with weaning, what is it about the psychology of these two characters that you find most fascinating, and were you by chance influenced by Lacan?
Yeah, I think that's a relevant touchstone for the story. Sure. I think a mirror is kind of a horrifying thing to be confronted with, because it's you and it's not. And the thing that is in the mirror, when you look, like when I was getting ready for the panel and putting on my makeup or whatever, I'm just taking for granted that that's me, because it's a tool, but it's not. The image that is in a mirror is like a product of light refracting and my own psychological ability to comprehend what it is that I'm seeing and what it means to me. And what you see in a mirror is it looks like something objective, but it is a visualization of your own inner state. You can, if you have a tendency towards body dysmorphia, can't relate. Just kidding. Then you literally, you look in the mirror and you see things that are not there. Or even that is not an ideal way to phrase it, because if you believe in them, then they are real. I know that sounds like sophistry, but if they're real to you, you see them and interact with them, then there's no practical difference between that and something that exists to other people, except that you can't convince other people that it matters. Let's see. So how does this relate to the psychology of the characters in my book?
Sorry, it's like a very heady question.
I know, you asked me a really intellectual question. I have a BFA. I took 4 semesters of philosophy and world history, and that's it. And that was a long time ago. I can
scale it back. I mean, I think ultimately the question is what inspired you to create the book and the characters, and I mean, clearly there's so much grief in Vision, and I guess what drove you to explore it through these characters? That's a more not heady way to say it, or yeah, sorry about that.
Oh no, it's great, I'm just intimidated. I can't I didn't write the book trying to make a statement about anything specific. I wrote it about stuff that I was feeling and going through, and themes emerge, which I then become aware of and can lean into. But I think that one of the major themes of it that I really wanted to explore was, you know, similar to what we were talking about with mirrors, like with that as the central metaphor, I guess. When you have a relationship with somebody, you are kind of looking for yourself in them. You need them to explain yourself to you. So you like somebody when the way that they see you is the way that you want to be seen. That makes you want to be around somebody. And if somebody perceives you in a way that doesn't feel true to you, then it's like unbearable to be around them. So the you know, Eleanor has this relationship with this figure in a mirror that is really, it's nothing more than a disembodied voice. Like, it doesn't really have any, I mean, obviously it has no corporeal form, but it you can't even really see it. It's like a smudge, which is hard to convey in the way that I draw, but I was thinking of, you know, like when a mirror is old and the silver on it gets cloudy, something like that. But this mirror is like constantly giving her back something that nobody else in her life is able to give her, which is like focused attention. It's sympathetic, it's caring towards her, and nobody else in her life really has time to do that. So even though there's so little there, even though it's just a voice, it because it is giving her what she needs, then it becomes the most important relationship in her life. Because it's the only reflection that makes sense to her, that feels true to her. Does that make sense?
That makes like complete sense. Like I think you like put it in such like clear terms that I never even realized about like love, you know, like you know, like really though, like I mean, maybe I'm not the only one who feels this way, but, and maybe not everyone does, but it's like, the people who you surround yourself with, your loved ones, people who love you, you know, like they're the ones who will advocate for you when, you know, the worst of your, you know, demons are saying mean things about you, and they're the ones who will see you for how you want to be seen and how, you know, like that's like, wow, I love that. I really like it makes so much sense.
This is something that's been really challenging for me with quarantine, is just like being around people, even certainly my friends and loved ones, but also just like miscellaneous, like people in the street, on the sidewalk, on the train. Like you get a certain amount of feedback just from people reacting to your presence. Like, it's weird how I start to feel like I don't exist in the same way because other people are not perceiving me, you know? Like, so much of my understanding of who and what I am in the world is coming from like this echolocation of me, like bouncing my presence off people and then getting this feedback that yes, I exist. And I have to like, you know, like I'm on Twitter, I go on Twitter and I'm like, can you just like somebody tell me about a time that we hung out, like to like remind me that we really know each other, you know? Just that need to we're not,
you know, like, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
We're not like isolated individuals, not really. We're a social like organism. We're a network of humanity. We're not islands. And if you are not having relationships with people that are meaningful to you, then there's a part of you that doesn't exist. There's it's like missing a limb. It's very frightening.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
really disorienting.
Yeah. And now that you've said it, I feel like, and I'm also like looking back at Vision in a different way too. Like, it's, you know, Eleanor goes through so much, like every little thing kind of whittles away at her being, and she's
Mhm.
trying so hard to hold on to it and like feel realness, you know, and physicality, and it's just, yeah, thank you for that. That's so illuminating and beautiful. Thank you.
Well, thank you for asking such a good question.
So my next question is actually for everybody. So I feel like, you know, it's no accident then that all of you were brought into this particular panel. So to me, the kind of link that I found between all of your stories is that you each break the fourth wall in different ways. With Adventure Zone starting as a D&D podcast, it kind of comes with the territory. And in Glasstown's case, the narrative contains a meta-narrative, you know, with Charles and Charlotte talking to each other, and sort of like, but us witnessing them talking to each other already sort of calls to attention that it's a work of fiction, you know. And with Vision, the line between the reader and Eleanor is super thin, and it's like the fact that there is another observer in the room, the mirror, and the speaking mirror calls to attention that you know, that there's, it's kind of weird, you know, like that there's two observers at the same time, the reader and then this embodied voice in the story. And in Spellbound, Bashaki, you address the reader directly. I'm curious about how each of you conceived these meta narratives and why they're so vital to your respective stories, and what experience you wanted to create through them. So I'm gonna start with Carrie, and then we'll just go round robin.
Cool. Yeah, I think you kind of touched on the Adventure Zone podcast has this element baked in, right? Because the podcast itself is a recording not just of the story that's generated through tabletop play, but also of like the McElroys sitting together and like having a fun time playing a game as a family. So I think that's what we were really trying to capture in the adaptation process, is how can we translate that feeling of camaraderie, of like the sense that even when things are difficult in the actual like base level, I'm trying to like draw a diagram of stories with my hands. In the base level narrative, even when things get difficult, they kind of have this shared experience to fall back on. So the way we ended up landing on doing that visually was just to kind of take all of that like table talk and condense it into one narrator character, like the GM. And then the way we decided on doing that visually is very literal, in that we have a literal visual representation of the GM, who's the only character who can actually cross over panel borders. And I mean that not in like a metaphysical sense, but like I draw him so that he always has like an elbow hanging outside of panel. It would be great if Zoom technology would let me like gently reach down into someone else's frame to demonstrate, but we're not quite there yet. So that was kind of I really like that as a visual shorthand, because he is the only character who can do that. So it is an immediate example or an immediate reminder to the reader that like this is different. This is someone who is following different rules from the rest of the characters, and kind of this story exists on a different level. So I don't want to sidetrack, but I am really curious and interested to hear about like the different visual languages that everyone else is using to do that same kind of meta-narrative separation, right? Because Isabel, you talked about a little bit the way that comics has all of these different tool sets that you can use to separate visually what's going on. And like, to me, one of the things that struck me in Glasstown was the color palette shifts when they go from like the narrative into Glasstown itself. And then in Vision, there's like this really eerie and haunting and cool like framing difference in terms of when Eleanor is talking about some of the horrible things that are happening, and the perspective gets in so close to her that you're kind of forced to take on that character. And then Apsara Engine does so much really cool stuff with the way that paneling rhythm changes when someone is telling a story within a story. And even the use of like dialogue versus captioning and like the regularity of the rhythm of the panel seemed like a really interesting way to separate those two things. So I just want to hear everybody else talk, please, because they're all very good comics.
So maybe let's start with Isabel.
Yeah, that's so interesting what you say about the when you were talking about the character putting his elbow out of the panel. I wanted to be like, yes, yes. I think that's what I loved so much about doing, like what I love so much about using the kind of story within a story within a story thing in a graphic novel is how you can just literally use the medium to signify and help the reader. And yeah, I love it so much. I think what is at the heart of Glasstown is the kind of relationship between the creator and their creations. And I think what I loved was that when I was creating it, I was like aware that there was this like great third level, which was like me creating a creator who was creating creations. And I was like, oh, this is just amazing. And I think Charlotte Bronte was also aware of that as well. And there's this really amazing paragraph in one of her diaries where she's writing as Charles Wellesley, who's one of her characters. And he actually says like, oh, I imagined that I was the figment of someone else's imagination. So she was imagining her character, imagining what he would feel if he realized he was invented. And I think that's what gave me the idea to start to sort of have this like play between Charlotte's creations and her, and this kind of like pushback. And I think at one point in the book, I talk about how she set the characters going, but they've gone off and they've done their own thing, which I guess to bring it back to the first question, really gave me the freedom to play with them as I liked. But yeah, in terms of like visuals and the visual language that I use to sort of signal the different meta narratives, I used color a lot. So there are like 4 plot strands that run alongside each other. There's Charlotte and Charles in the present day, and she's the last of the Bronte siblings alive. And I felt like that was a really sort of like poignant and sad sort of like, you know, all of her fellow collaborators who she'd worked with her whole life are all dead, and she's left alone. And so that color palette I kept as sort of like blues and grays. The flashbacks to her childhood where she's running wild on the moors and they're inventing this world, I used sort of sepia. But then Glasstown itself is full color, and that was definitely deliberate. There's a bit Charlotte writes in one of her diaries where it's called like Farewell to Glasstown, and it wasn't actually her farewell to Glasstown. Like she repeatedly like went back and made, you know, more sequels or whatever. But she kind of wrote this bit of text sort of saying that the burning climes of the Angrian skies or whatever were just too much for her, and she needed to like step back to grey reality. And I thought this idea that your internal world would be more vivid and more appealing to you than the reality was kind of sort of both terrifying but amazing. And in these diaries, she's being a teacher at school, and she hates it and she doesn't like the students, and her imaginary world, what she's writing, starts to kind of find its way onto the pages of the diary. And I thought, oh god, it's sort of so scary but so amazing. I think she was probably having some kind of a breakdown. I think that's generally acknowledged by her biographers or whatever. But for me, when I read that stuff, I was like, this is what has to be at the heart of the book, this kind of creator-creation relationship. And in terms of like literal physical devices that I used, I think I might have done a few like elbows out of the panel as well. And also because maps were really important, I felt like maps are really important. Like I love maps of imaginary worlds. But also a lot of the plot lines involve kind of like battles. So I played a lot with characters stepping in and out of maps of Glasstown, and there's a scene where I sort of show Charlotte and Charles like with those big sticks they have in films, naval films, where like pushing the ships across little tables. I don't know what you call them, but I sort of had Charlotte and Charles kind of almost like directing the play. Like they're the dungeon masters, the games master. What do you call it in D&D? Yeah,
Dungeon master, game master, yeah.
Game master.
They were the game masters. And so yeah, that's kind of how I felt. It felt such a right thing to adapt. And yeah, that's me.
Thank you so much. Bashak, how about you?
So that's I'll say right off the bat, in Apsara Engine, there's also a great deal of, well, in one story particularly, of imaginary maps being created, and that's the sort of heart of the story. And the two characters slip in and out of the worlds that are created as they're creating the map within the story. So I just wanted to give a shout out to the Imaginary Maps crew. So I was also going to say, I also, in terms of like how to, the separation between the narrator and the meta narrator, what I also used color to do that. So like in the part of the book where I'm addressing the reader, it's sort of this duotone, sort of orange and indigo color palette, whereas the rest of the book is full color. So I guess what that does is I think, as was being hinted before, it's like gives the reality of me talking to the reader a somewhat dreamlike quality, whereas the imaginary aspect of the book, which is the bulk of the book, becomes more palpable because it's in full color and it seems more direct and real. As far as like how I came back into the book, I think that happened because, as I was saying originally, when before I thought this could become a book, and the character of Anjali as a substitute seemed to me like a very simple device, and one that I didn't put too much emotional investment in at the time, suddenly became, as the project became more book-like, became very fraught. Like the whole thing became a conceit that took on much more importance than I thought it would have done in the first place. So I felt like I had to reintroduce myself into the story in order to explain the conceit. Otherwise you'd think that I was this cisgendered narrator, right? So I had to come back in to explain that the substitution of the cisgendered narrator is actually me substituting a cisgendered woman to sort of echo my own trans movement towards being transgender, which is all sorts of messed up. But anyway, my introducing myself back into the story was something I really didn't want to do in the first place, which is why I had the substitute character. So when I did come back and had to draw myself, which is, again, not something I ever wanted to do, it became a whole, that device for me became a little problematic, but I think I'm starting to get used to it, much in the same way that I'm starting to get used to seeing myself on a screen, or in, we'll leave behind mirrors for the moment, and for me anyway. But the screen has become something that I'm getting used to in the same way that I'm starting to draw myself more, and that may have some, trans sort of narrative within it, but I'm not sure. In any case, yeah, I felt like I had to bring myself back in order to make sense of the central conceit of the book and to explain that to the reader,
Yeah, totally. And I think it's like, if the reader were just to, read Anjali's bits and not like have any kind of introduction or like ending that you created, like there's some, I think also, I mean, this might just be me overanalyzing, but like I think there's a part of you that like wanted to explain, it's not even that like you could have totally just put out the book and okay, this is Anjali's story and it's a great story. But then I think maybe there's a part of you, okay, sorry, I don't mean to get all psychoanalytic.
No, please.
There's a part of you that wants to be seen and recognized, right?
Yeah.
Like, and that's why, you're there.
Absolutely.
think-
I mean, and it's also, yeah, part of it. I think, as I was saying, she started to like take on her own characteristics as I was starting to come into my own. So I think it was interesting to start to explain that parallel track, um,
Yeah,
and not
yeah, totally.
have that come back into the story, even if it was slightly obliquely. Um, so yeah, and all, it just it gives it gives the book again another sort of like hybrid quality, which I ended up like
Yeah,
was totally unforeseen um,
yeah, yeah.
when I first started this as a project.
Yeah. But I also think that that's cool because it lets readers understand that like these things really evolve. You can start something and then like have it be finished, but then kind of go back and add more context around it. And like it doesn't have to be this thing with a beginning and end that in the traditional sense, right?
Mhm, mhm.
Which is really cool. So for Julia, like and Envision, you know, I mean, I felt like there was a meta narrative in there, but again, maybe I'm reading too much into it. I was wondering,
No,
like, if
please
you
do.
felt like there do you feel like there was a meta narrative that you were creating in Vision, and you know, do you feel like what kind of how did that add to the story and kind of convey the story that you wanted to convey?
Hmm. Um, like we were talking about, I feel like hearing you guys talk about the way that you conveyed different levels of narrative with color and with paneling, like I really kind of handicapped myself because I only did, the book is only black and white, and it's 9-panel grids all the way through. Nobody pokes out. But
Although she does fall into the mirror at one point.
yes, and there's also like, there are moments where I take advantage of that, like that, once you've been reading for a few pages of like the same, everything is going to be black and white and it's all going to be 9 panels and it's very, very regular. This is like, somebody told me once, this is like the most comics with an X way to make comics when all your panels are exactly the same. Uh, it's kind of precious, but you kind of in reading it, like you adapt that to your sense of timing and stuff, and then I can do things with it like uh, I like to choose an image and stay on it for multiple panels, and that can be a really interesting device for controlling the pace at which the reader is going through the story. For example, there's there's a part, this was really hard for me to draw because it was so disconcerting for me. But there's a series of 3 panels where a character is very, very close in the frame, like so close that maybe her face is cut off a little bit on the sides, and she's screaming right in the face of another character. But so you get that character's POV, and then it's just a big face screaming at you. It was hard for me to draw 3 times, let alone once, because it's not comfortable to just look at somebody screaming. I looked for reference images and I was like, I cannot deal. I had to like take quick glances of myself in the mirror to do it. And I hope that it's at least a little bit as disconcerting for people when they read it. But the fact that like, that I took the time to draw it 3 different times. You can tell when you look at them that they're 3 different drawings because my drawing is not super consistent or clean. Like, or there are a few sections in the book where there's several consecutive panels or pages that are only blank or only black panels. And and they're staticky because I colored them in by hand. So you can feel like little fragments of something is there, you know, like when it's dark, like when it's totally dark and like your eye wants to see things, even though there's nothing to see. But when you see that, like you as the reader know that I drew that, like that those little fragments exist because I took the time to color it in by hand. And it creates like a sense in you of, I hope, of like the time and thought that goes into somebody sitting there. And like, even if you don't like stop and contemplate each individual black panel, which you could do, that would be great. I don't necessarily expect people to do that. But I'm relying on the reader's sense of the book being a thing that was made by somebody, to help convey this sense of like the oppressiveness of this darkness, or that, you know, this is not just like a thing that happened and then it was dark for a while. This is a thing that I chose to show you. Like, I need you to look at this for the story. This is, even though there's nothing to see, there's as a comics reader, you understand that this is also a form of communication, me making you look at this particular thing, which I hadn't necessarily thought of as fourth wall breaking, but I think it totally is. That kind of involving the reader and the thing that is going on in the story.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like forcing the reader, not forcing, but like
No, I'm forcing.
Yeah. the you know, like adding those black panels, it slows the reading down, you know.
Yeah.
And it kind of, it just, you know, makes you understand that there's this kind of like unconscious falling into despair, you know, that's going on in between those pages, you know. And I think that it's interesting because like comics do really lend themselves very well to meta narratives. I mean, can you imagine this being, you know, TV and like a voiceover, and it, you know, voiceovers are like a little bit too cheesy, like on you know, film medium, but like for some reason they work really well in comics. I feel like Alison Bechdel does it a lot in Fun Home too, you know, and but it becomes like visual poetry, you know. It's really, you know, you can do so much with comics and convey like in the same way that illustrations evoke an idea or an emotion, you can do that with a comics panel and add in dialogue or narrative to like add even more layers, which is like you all do it so beautifully. I just want to wrap everything up and thank Carrie, Bashak, Julia, and Isabel, and everyone. Please remember to order books in the link below and consider making a donation to the Brooklyn Book Festival, which is celebrating its 15th year of presenting free literary programs.